Welcome to On Your Own Terms. I'm Patty Talbot, and this is the place where we learn together what it takes to change the world on our own terms and in our own special way. Today, I'm so pleased and privileged to have with me one of my neighbors and someone I've known for many years, Anne Campbell. I first met Anne because she was the nurse practitioner at my OBGYN as I was getting ready to deliver both of my sons, who are now in their late 30s. So that's how long I've known Anne. But I've also known her because we went to the same church and because our children grew up together. Her oldest son and my oldest son are the same age, and her daughter and my youngest son are the same age. And now, lo and behold, I find myself living in the same neighborhood where Anne has lived with her wonderful husband, Greg, for many years. But today I specifically invited Anne to be with us because I've been watching her work over a number of years, about 15 years, on a very special project that's near and dear to her heart that also is very important to me. And that is around the work of hospice. You're going to learn about Anne's work in our local community to initiate and get off the ground a project called the Sojourn House, a place where people can go for their end-of-life journey. Anne agreed to tell her story today using Blue Road's framework, Homegrown Solutions for a Patchwork World. Welcome, Anne. We are here to learn from you today. Anne Campbell.
Thank you, Patty, and I really appreciate your asking me to do this. I'm honored, to be considered in your mind a change agent for our community. And I was born and raised in Blacksburg, Virginia, and I left for probably about 10 years, going to school and working, and then returned to Blacksburg in 1980. My dad grew up in Maine, and he was the first person in his family to go to college. And when he left for school, he was basically told good luck. And so he had to finance his entire education on his own. And so as an influencer, to me, one of his big things in life was education. And so he went on and got a PhD and taught as a college professor in horticulture, ultimately at Virginia Tech in Blacksburg. The other thing about my father, maybe this is because he was a northern maniac, as they're called. He was a very upfront person, and he had kind of a mantra or motto that was reinforced at home all the time. And that was that you must be a contributing member to society. And that always really stuck, and I think is part of my being who I am. My mom was raised on a farm in Ohio. So she has that work ethic as well. She went to secretarial school and also taught piano. They were a nice blend, I think, together. She was more a person who stressed the importance of relationship and of kindness, and brought that to the table, I think, in my life. And she was also very community spirited. She was extremely active in our church, in her garden club. She did flower arrangements every week for the church. And they jointly were together in things like playing bridge, all the kid things, and a key family activity related to, as I say, digging in the dirt, which I love to this day. We knew in the summertime that we had to pick row 1 and 3 of the beans and the first row of the raspberries, and this sort of thing before we could go swimming with our friends or do other activities. So there was a work ethic contributing to the good of the family. The way my foundation in the family influenced me was that there was just this normal expectation that you were going to become educated and that you were going to contribute to the community around you, and you were going to also contribute to folks from all different backgrounds. The other thing I think that is quite an influencer for me is I was born the last child, the sixth child of my parents. As the last child, my mom was 41 when I was born. At that time, which was in the early 1950s, that was really an elderly mother. And so I lived a life with parents who were older. And as the child and only child who returned home, I became the caregiver of my parents as they aged. And that was a big influencer for me and for my children, because my husband and I have two children, and they were raised with one set of grandparents that were 20 years younger than the other set of grandparents. No one else in my family was engaged in any type of healthcare, but after my sophomore year in college, I decided that I would transfer to the University of Virginia to go to nursing school. One of my experiences there, which I always remembered, was that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross came to speak to the nursing school. And as most of you know, she wrote On Death and Dying, and that was written in 1969, and this was like in 1973 when she came. And even though at that time in nursing school, I felt like my interest would be in pediatrics, I was totally taken by her conversation and have never forgotten it. She was the go-to guru on death and dying and grief. So she actually had a part. I read her books soon after she came. I think of ultimately at this stage in my life, having an interest in health and education about end of life and being a promoter of hospice and hospice care. When I finished nursing school, I worked in a pediatric emergency room and then in a newborn intensive care unit at both of those at the Medical College, Virginia, and then in a coronary care unit. I wanted to work in the high-tech, active, adventurous locations. My husband and I decided that we would be married and that we would try to see if we could make it work in the New River Valley. I decided I needed to change my direction in healthcare in order to make it work in this location in Blacksburg. That the route was to become a nurse practitioner. I wanted the expanded role, and in exploring our area, I felt like obstetrics and gynecology would be the area that would probably most likely work, because there were no nurse practitioners in the New River Valley at that time. So I worked for 25 years as an OBGYN nurse practitioner, the other end of life from my interest as a change maker, I would say now, which is in hospice care and end of life care. But they blend together so well, it's like at the beginning of life and the end of life, you really only have one chance to get it right. You don't have replays that can be done there. And so it's a very important time. And it's a time that there's the unfortunate opportunity to create a lot of trauma in people's lives if it's not done right. So it's very important. 2 years before I retired, my father died of colon cancer. And we chose, or my mom primarily chose, to have hospice care for him. And it was a wonderful experience. And she had knowledge of hospice, having worked as a volunteer for hospice during her life. So it was an automatic decision that we wanted hospice. After his death, he was 91. My mom lived another 2.5 years, and she gradually had dementia. I had to hire people to help take care of her in her home. And ultimately, I had left my position. I didn't realize I was retiring at that time, but I was, in order to take care of her. So I cared for her. She lived only about a mile away, and she wanted to stay in her home. She also had the benefit of hospice services at that time. And it worked. It worked well for both my dad and my mom to have hospice care in the home. Soon after they died, I became involved with a group in town that felt like it was really important to get more people educated about hospice care. And this group was started by several hospice physicians and nurses. The goal of that group at that time was to really educate healthcare providers, focusing on nurses, focusing on nurses' aides, on how important it was to educate families about hospice care and what a benefit it was. While doing that work, I was approached by several, again, hospice physicians and hospice nurses and a few other community members about the real need for something, some way, somehow to help patients at the end of life who were falling through the cracks. They might already be hospice patients, but it wasn't working for them to have home hospice care. Something else was needed. It may be that they didn't have the financial resources to even have a safe home for the dying person to live in. It sometimes was the fact that there was a family situation where the death occurring in the home was not a good thing. Maybe there was a young child. Maybe there was a person with mental health issues for which a death in the home just was very traumatic for someone there. And very often it was because you had two elderly people that could no longer care for each other, and they needed some place for the hospice care to take place. And there may be adult children, but they were working and they had their own life that they had to take care of. So this group of 10 people got together in 2007, actually, and decided that we needed to work on getting some type of place that this problem could be solved, where people who it wasn't working at home but were on hospice could find relief and find support. So what do we do as a community to support this? And we learned that there are places called inpatient hospice facilities, commonly known as hospice houses, that are built just for this purpose. It took a couple years as we were getting our 501c3, getting our board organized, really deciding what we wanted to do, decided that we wanted to, in fact, build a hospice house for the New River Valley. At that time, there were only 4 hospice houses in the entire state of Virginia. And the Virginia Department of Health, who has the regulations related to hospice houses, were in their infancy with how to deal with hospice houses. What were the regulations? What could they do, etc. But the one thing we knew was that the Virginia Department of Health required that if you set up a hospice house, which can do very high level of acute hospice care, very similar to that in a hospital, that you had to have a hospice agency to clinically operate that hospice facility. Finding that hospice agency in the New River Valley has been one of our greatest challenges. So we approached a number of hospice agencies. We went through literally years of research, of networking, of conversation. We applied and received a number of grants. We have wonderful community members and churches that have helped us along the way. Let's fast forward to 2022. Where are we today after over a decade of work? Our idea about a hospice house, because there are no other hospice houses in our area, was to be kind of regionally broad. And we learned what we needed to do would become more centric just to our community. In our community, we actually have 7 hospice agencies. 2 of those are nonprofit, one that's associated with a big hospital system. We talked with all of these agencies, and particularly the nonprofits, without success on finding our operator. And Sojourn Center is the name of our project. Sojourn means a journey along the way, and what a great name for that end-of-life journey. So we made an approach to a local, large retirement community group called Warm Hearth Village. And Warm Hearth Village enjoyed a very good reputation in the community. Warm Hearth had already become a home health agency, as well as having serial retirement opportunities, nursing home, assisted living, independent living. So since Warm Hearth already had that home health connection with the Virginia Department of Health, moving into having a hospice agency connection was not a big stretch in Sojourn Center's mind. And in fact, we knew that Warm Hearth had becoming a hospice agency already on their long-term strategic plan. So, wow, let's consider joining partnership with Warm Hearth and them becoming a hospice agency, and then potentially becoming the clinical operator for Sojourn Center. What a great partnership. The town of Blacksburg officials thought this was great. We thought this was great. And actually, Warm Hearth thought it was pretty good too. So what a win-win-win for our community, because the community was going to benefit from having an inpatient facility for our community members here. So very wisely, Warm Hearth said, well, we are going to need several feasibility studies done to see if both financially and socially and for other reasons this would work for Warm Hearth Village. Sojourn Center agreed to pay for a feasibility study with two parts. One, what's the feasibility of this local retirement community becoming a hospice agency? Therefore, if the others were still here, making 8 hospice agencies offering services. And what was the possibility, once they became a hospice agency, that they would consider running Sojourn Center, an inpatient hospice facility? So we received a feasibility study report, both the 1st of August of this year and the 6th of October this year, which were very sobering and surprising results, saying that, wow, there have been a lot of changes, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, including the advent of COVID, the influence and change that has come with the management and operating of a hospice house. Those changes are primarily related to, with COVID directly, we have workforce shortages that are making it difficult to get adequate staffing for hospice houses. In the study that was done, the consultant who only works with hospice and hospice houses told us that over the last 3 to 5 years, the number of beds that are occupied in hospice houses has decreased. And in part, this is from some pretty severe monitoring and restrictions by Medicare on payment for hospice services in hospice houses. Become very restrictive, and part of that is that they are doing a lot of auditing of patients admitted to hospice houses, and while auditing, not paying the hospice houses for the services. So those are just a few of the rather surprising and sobering information that we received. And therefore, it put Warm Hearth in a position where they could not consider at this time becoming an operator while they are still working on the idea of becoming a hospice agency. Since having a clinical operator committed is so important to the success of a capital campaign, which Sojourn Center was going to take on, unlike in most places where the actual hospice agency would use that, we're a group of community members who say, we'll take on the capital campaign. We're talking about a $5 million campaign to build this facility. We already have our fundraiser. We already have our architect. We already have things right in line. And yet here we are with the current hospice leaders. We had a specific regional study done in addition to the national study. And they are telling us they, as already operators of hospice houses, say, I would not do this in this current environment of Medicare restrictions, of decreased hospice house occupancy. And the most important thing is the underutilization of hospice care in our county. The Sojourn Center project has been my life, really, for over a decade. It has been gut-wrenching. I have had days of lots of tears. I've had days where I just am not going to think about it as if it didn't happen at all. It's been a really personal, kind of spiritual time of searching on not the merits of the project, because I still feel absolutely committed, and our entire board feels absolutely committed to how our community could benefit from building Sojourn Center. But to believe that there really isn't enough utilization and that there's a regulatory system that is not allowing this service to move forward has just been very emotional. So I would say, in an effort to be a change agent in your community or in other people's lives or whatever it is, we have to be ready, but not plan to be ready, that things may not work out the way you want them to. Fortunately, our board of directors has chosen not to give up. And our plan is that we are just going to take what we call a temporary pause from the build effort, which of course implies going into fundraising and then building, but change our focus, refocus onto the fact that we have to address the underutilization of hospice in our community. We also have to address and monitor what's going on nationally and inform our citizens about the needs to communicate with our political base and our government agencies. Things don't always turn out the way you want them to, when you want them to. We haven't given up, but I would encourage conversation as you move towards your projects and your goals to realize that you may have to change focus and you may have to change direction, or what I call Sojourn Center has had a very circuitous path, which I think means a winding journey. And we're taking quite a little wind right now.
Thank you, Anne. I know that our audience has been moved and inspired by your work. And despite the fact that Sojourn House has come across some roadblocks, you have clearly shown the passion around this project. One thing that you didn't mention is that Sojourn House has received a donation for a large parcel of property that sits ready for that house when the time is right and the funding is there. Sojourn House has also some impressive personal donations. One you mentioned in the amount of $282,000. If you don't already know, you'll want to find out what's going on with hospice and hospice houses in your own community, because there is clearly a need and clearly not enough information available to make these important facilities available to the people who need them and their families at such a crucial and important time in life. It's a change worth making. I'm Patty Talbot. I'm always learning, and I know you are too.